Lace 'em up, let's start the show. We're digging in with Trip. 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 We're digging in with Trip today. Yeah.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Digging In. Momentarily, we're going to dig in with, a guy I've known for a long time. There isn't any realm of broadcasting, radio, television that he does not shine in, have his footprints, handprints in. Kenny Albert, whether it be for the New York Rangers, NBC Sports, Fox football, baseball. He does basketball. He does boxing, television, radio, everything under the sun. It's going to be a lot of fun to dig in with Kenny Albert, the son of the great Marv Albert. Boy, talking about great announcers momentarily. But before we do so, as we always do, want to encourage you to be as active as you possibly can on all forms of feedback when it comes to communication, audio platforms, on YouTube channels. Let us know where we're at, how we're doing, how we can get better. Also, our terrific producer and my partner on Digging In, Adam the Admiral Holtzman, has just done really an extraordinary job of updating our merchandise site. Aside from the look of the site, I am flat out thrilled about all the different options, whether it be visors like this here on YouTube, this beautiful Patriot. Boy, very important to remember we live in the greatest country on earth right now, the red, white, and blue. I'm here in Michigan. Things are getting colder. We have some unisex hoodies. We have the heater, Black Beauty, when it comes to toques to keep you warm when it gets cold. Those are just some of the things on our website. So please check out digintrip.com. Our presenting sponsor. They have been with us. They continue to be with us. They're steadfast. New Country Auto Group with outstanding dealerships ranging from Ford, Mercedes, Ferrari. Gosh, I'm still thinking about our great Ford episode with my cousin's CEO, Jim Farley. No, New Country Auto Group has Ferrari, BMW, Mercedes, Maserati, Lexus. You know, if you prefer an escape pod, like the one that left the Empire Destroyer, whatever it was in Star Wars, the smart car, they've got that too. NewCountry.com. Dealerships in New York, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Florida. Family-owned, family-run, complete in everything they do. And a special shout-out to my dear friend, tip of the cap here on YouTube, Jared the Nooch Cantanucci, Harvard grad, former Harvard hockey player, natural goal scorer back in his day at Shattuck St. Mary's before he decided to go all in on the automotive dealing experience. So please check out New Country. Without further ado, actually before I mention that, please tune in at the end of the show. We have a new feature on YouTube, Rapid Fire. It's going to be presented by @Audio627, the fastest vessel on any nautical body of water. We're going to have Rapid Fire for the first time with Kenny Albert at the end of the Digging In episode with Kenny that we will now get knee-deep in. Well, Kenny, you and I have been dear friends for a long time, so you're familiar with the podcast. We've been trying to find a time to get you on, so I don't think I need to introduce what Digging In means to me and what the show's all about. You know, you've done it. So, Kenny Albert, how do you define Digging In?
Well, first of all, Trip, it's great to finally be with you on Digging In. And one of the best things about the NHL realignment 5 or 6 years ago was the Rangers and Hurricanes coming together in the Metropolitan Division so we could see each other even more often, right?
No doubt about it. No doubt. You had me from hello. I feel like I'm Jerry Maguire. Keep going.
There you go. My definition of digging in would be, and I get asked, I speak to high school and college broadcasting students all the time, now virtually, but prior to this year, I visit sportscasting camps throughout the summer. And the number one thing that I try to impart on them is how important the preparation is. If you want to become a broadcaster, whether it's play-by-play, color analyst, sideline reporter, studio host, news anchor, to me, that's the number one thing I learned is the preparation aspect. So I feel like no matter what the event is that I'm about to work, I love the digging in aspect of it, doing the research, watching prior games, reading, pouring through statistics and other information. So to me, at least in our profession, that's a big part of what digging in means to me for sure.
Kenny, I want to, no pun intended, I want to dig into who you are, my friend, and the tremendous professional you are. You know, we see in hockey, for instance, a sport we both cover, sometimes when a guy has to follow a legend, big shoes to fill, your dad, Marv, a legend in the broadcasting business. Tell me about what life was like. Take it from the top. I know you live in Jersey. Did you grow up in Jersey as well?
I grew up on Long Island.
Okay.
So I actually lived in Manhattan for the first 2.5 years of my life. And then we moved to Long Island, which is where I went to elementary school, middle school, high school, went to college in New York at NYU. So grew up in the New York area. I've lived in Jersey for over 20 years now. Never knew much about the state aside from Newark Airport, the New Jersey Turnpike, and the Meadowlands. But we live in northern New Jersey. It's a great area. My kids have grown up here, and very happy to say that we've been New Jersey residents since 1999. But growing up, when I think back, it was great. I grew up around my father, and his work, obviously, and his brothers, Al and Steve, who were also longtime play-by-play broadcasters. So in the 70s, when I was growing up, Trip, I was born in 68, and my father was doing the Rangers on the radio, the Knicks on the radio. He was doing the 6 and 11 p.m. sportscasts at Channel 4, WNBC in New York, basically for my entire childhood, from the time I was in kindergarten in 1973 until high school graduation. And then on the weekends, he would do NFL games, first with the New York Giants on the radio, and then transition to the national broadcast on NBC. He added boxing later on. He did a baseball pregame show. So he was really involved in all four of the sports. He didn't do baseball play-by-play, but he did a pregame show for NBC for a number of years. My uncles at the time in the 70s, they both were Islanders broadcasters at different times. In the early 80s, they worked Devils hockey games, but probably were more known for basketball and boxing. Al did the Denver Nuggets, the Indiana Pacers. Steve did the Nets, and then the Golden State Warriors and the Phoenix Suns, and boxing on Showtime, and Al did boxing on USA Network. So they were involved in hockey, basketball, boxing. And I always joke that when I was growing up, any family get-togethers, holidays, I felt like I was listening to the first all-sports radio station, because we would sit around the table and they would be telling stories about the various teams and networks that they worked for. It was great. I didn't know any different. That was my upbringing. And when I was 5, I was given a tape recorder for my birthday from my parents, a toy tape recorder. And I started announcing games into the recorder. I was never told you have to do this, was never forced to get into broadcasting. But what kid wouldn't love going to sporting events and tagging along and watching games on TV all the time? My mother was she was a big sports fan, still is, but they met at Shea Stadium. My mother was an usherette. They had female ushers for the Mets. In 1964, it was the Mets' first year at Shea Stadium. They had played their first 2 seasons at the Polo Grounds, the former home of the New York Giants baseball and football teams. So my mother gets a job at the age of 19 or 20 working at Shea Stadium. My father was hired to do the pregame show on WHN radio. And before the first ever Mets home game in May of 1964, they wanted to interview some of the various folks working in the stadium on the radio on the pregame show. So they pulled up a couple of folks into the press box, including one of the usherettes. And that's actually how they met at a Mets baseball game in 64.
Wow. Kenny.
So if it weren't for the New York Mets, we wouldn't be chatting right now.
First of all, when you first said your dad working for WNBC, I said, WNBC. WNBC, of course, Howard Stern in the movie Private Parts.
And even Imus before then. And Imus used to call our house. He would call in to have him as a guest on the radio show. So we would hear that WNBC all the time. But, I know I gave a long answer to a short question, but it was just great. I would tag along to games. When I was old enough, I would start keeping stats for him at Ranger games and then at Knick games later on. And I felt like I was learning via osmosis. When I was in high school, a small cable station came to my school, and I volunteered to broadcast the basketball game. They were just going to videotape the game without announcers, and I wound up working over 100 games for them over the next 3 years. I felt like I had such a head start over other kids my age because of this experience with Cox Cable on Long Island as well.
Okay, I want to dig into that element a little bit because right now you've been in a portion where you're handling the NFL. You do it in stellar fashion. You long have for Fox, as you handle every Fox, sport that there is. Take a guy like the star Christian McCaffrey on the Carolina Panthers. His father was a football player. We know examples of it in the National Hockey League. Let's look at Keith Tkachuk and his sons that are shining in the NHL. Your dad's a legend. Did he push you at all? It sounds like he let you choose your own path. A, is that correct? It sounds like it is. And then B, how was it, and is it an advantage that very few broadcasters have in terms of learning the type of way to be good?
Never pushed whatsoever. Never once said I had to do this. I was pretty quiet as a youngster. And, when I started broadcasting the games, whether into my tape recorder or on Cox Cable in high school, I think that's when he really first saw that this was something I was interested in. I also did a lot of writing. I was a sports writer in high school, and in college, I was the sports editor of the high school newspaper. So I think at one point he thought maybe I would go that direction as well. But never once did I feel like there was any pressure as far as you have to go into this profession. I know there are lawyers whose fathers are lawyers and doctors whose sons and daughters get into the profession. So it's certainly not unique to sportscasting, but there are a number of us who did follow in the footsteps. But never did I feel that pressure or that push once along the way. And he would give advice. He would listen to the tapes in high school and college. But I think more so it was me learning by osmosis, not only by listening to him, but so many others. In the New York area, we had 9 professional teams when I was growing up. So I would listen to the radio all the time. I would watch games on TV. We had one kitchen in the radio that picked up the Hartford station. So I would listen to Chuck Caton on Whalers games. And I tell Chuck the story all the time. I have such great memories as a youngster listening to Chuck doing Whalers games on the radio. So I would try and listen and watch as many games as possible. And just to fast forward a bit, I felt like one of the greatest experiences for me, personally and professionally, was my first job out of college. I was very fortunate to get hired by the Baltimore Skipjacks of the American Hockey League. And I spent 2 years there. And, you could certainly relate to this as well, having spent time in the minor leagues. But there's nothing more valuable than the reps, the experience. And I worked 160 games in 2 years. But not only did the broadcasts, I worked in the team office. I handled some marketing and public relations and sales, and I would pick players up from the airport. Really, whatever the team needed done, we would all chip in. We only had 7 or 8 of us in the entire office. But those 2 years, I was able to sort of establish my own identity, as well as the next 3 years in Washington with the Capitals, away from home, away from New York. But I wouldn't trade those 2 years in for anything. And when I think back, we had Joel Quenneville on our team in 1991. He was towards the end of his playing career. He's gone on to be one of the greatest coaches in NHL history. Barry Trotz was our assistant coach. He was my roommate on the road. So can you imagine a 22-year-old kid learning from guys like Joel Quenneville and Barry Trotz and Robbie Laird, who was our head coach, and some of the terrific young players who were on the team at that time as well?
Yeah, it's spectacular. And I know how meaningful it was for you. Your roommate, Barry Trotz, finally winning the Stanley Cup, and Washington getting their first one. And, of course, Joel has 3 in recent memory with Chicago. I hope you weren't doing in that room with Barry. You weren't doing shoulder presses. I wouldn't go shoulder to shoulder with him. What a super guy.
My two biggest memories in the hotel room with Barry One was a road trip in Utica. We arrived at like 3 or 4 in the morning from another
Yeah.
game elsewhere, and there was a snowstorm. It was freezing. I think we were at a Holiday Inn, Utica, New York, first floor room. We get in there. The heat's not working. The snow and the cold's coming in under the door, and we both wound up sleeping in not only in all of our clothes, but in our winter coats as well, with our hats and gloves on for the entire night. And then there was a playoff game in Binghamton. Barry was the assistant coach, so one of his duties was to edit together, splice together the film, the VHS tape. Back in the day, that was the technology at the time. And he had the game tape, but he would have to edit together power plays and penalty killing and other, situational, type things that took place during the game. And I'm sitting on my bed trying to go to sleep after the game. It's 1 a.m. Barry's on his bed editing the tapes together. He had 2 VCRs and wires connecting them. And one of the tapes, you're old enough to remember the VHS tape. Sometimes it would get stuck.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Barry had to have this film ready for Robbie Laird, the head coach, in the morning. And fortunately, as part of my radio equipment, I was my own engineer back then. I had a little screwdriver, and that was perfect for Barry to try. And he opened up this VCR, and he was doing surgery on it. And I wasn't too good of a teammate because I fell asleep after about a half hour while he was still working on the VCR. But when I woke up in the morning, somehow he fixed it. It took about 3 hours, but he fixed the VCR with the help of the screwdriver from the radio equipment, and he was able to get the tapes edited in time for the morning meetings.
I'm going to have to ask Barry the next time I see him when, the Hurricanes play the Islanders, if he was good at, you remember that game Operation?
Yep.
Where you had to, you had to have good surgical hands. Barry must have those.
Well, that was a great story, which he'll remember. And you can also ask him, it's probably too long to tell here, but you can ask him about the, quote, fake arrest that he set up. They got me one year in Sydney, Nova Scotia. They would set up somebody every year, a broadcaster, a trainer, a player, and I was the victim 1 year, set up by Barry Trotz.
I'm gonna have to dig into that story.
Oh, he'll tell that story to whoever wants to listen.
I'm gonna, because I'm picturing you two in that frigid room.
Oof.
And Barry probably was wearing more clothes than he has when he's coached Winter Classic outdoor games.
Now he tells his memory must not be too great, because when he tells the story now, he claims that I asked him to cuddle in the cold, but that is certainly not the case.
Barry wanted a spoon fest. Right around this time here, for those watching on YouTube, Kenny, you've gotten to know my mom quite well. She loves you. That this portrait, she had this ridiculous, those watching on YouTube, this ridiculous outfit put on me. But around that time, my dad sponsored hockey. And as a young goalie on his team, sometimes it was hard, because I had to earn the respect of my teammates, because every year it started, it's the sponsor's kid. He made the team because his dad's a sponsor. You are an elite announcer in every sport you call. What has that been like? Carving your own path, I should say paving your own path, and proving, independent of Marv, hey, listen, I feel pretty good about the job that I do as well, because I don't know, unless you've lived in a similar circumstance, that's not easy.
I never really felt the pressure whatsoever. I think those 5 years in Maryland, 2 with the Skipjacks, 3 with the Capitals, like I said earlier, really helped in establishing my own identity and doing it outside of New York. But I also felt confident in my abilities, and we all want to prove ourselves. I remember games early on where you have all this information and you try to get too much in instead of letting the game dictate. But we all did that at a young age to try and prove that we did the work. I was also real fortunate in 94 when Fox acquired the rights to the NFC. Rupert Murdoch made this crazy bid and stole the NFC package away from CBS. And a number of us were in the right place at the right time. I never imagined in my wildest dreams. My goal was to do hockey on the radio. That was my goal in college and coming out of college. And then when I worked in Washington at Home Team Sports, hired by the Capitals and HTS in 92, did have the opportunity to fill in on some college basketball, some Orioles baseball games, some Bullets basketball games at the time. So, that's when I really started to expand my horizons and think, maybe I can do more than hockey. And in 94, like I said, when late 93, early 94, when Fox winds up with the NFL, at the time, CBS and NBC were the two NFL Sunday packages, and all of the play-by-play broadcasters seemed like they were in their late 40s, 50s, 60s. They had all been doing it forever. So none of us imagined working NFL football on the TV side, but Fox decided to hire a couple of veteran crews at the time to establish credibility. Pat Summerall and John Madden, two of the all-time greats.
Oh, yeah.
Matt Millen and Dick Stockton on the number 2 team, who, by the way, worked a game for Fox the other day. They're still going strong. And Fox decided to hire 4 younger groups to try and develop. And I'm really proud to say that Joe Buck and myself were among the young play-by-play announcers hired at the time. Kevin Harlan, who now works for CBS. And Joe and I were still there 27 years later. Kevin Harlan's had a great career with CBS and Turner, but they took a chance. Joe also, of course, had a legendary father in the business, the Hall of Famer Jack Buck, and he had never done football before. I had done Division III college football. That was it. And we were able to develop. They used to call them the skim milk games, the 2% games, the games that would go to 2% of the country. My first game was the LA Rams and the Arizona Cardinals, and it was blacked out in LA because it wasn't sold out. So I worked the 2% games back then. But again, the experience was so valuable. And now, as crazy as it sounds, here I am 430-something NFL games later, getting ready for the Dallas Cowboys and the Minnesota Vikings this weekend. But again, I always felt like the preparation was the key, having a great rapport with your color analysts, as you know, and I've worked with over 200 in the various sports through the years, many of them for only one game and others for hundreds of games. So, I feel very lucky, Tripp, and I'm sure you feel the same way. I never feel like I'm going to work. There's a lot of work that goes into it. There's a lot of travel, especially during normal times when I'm bouncing back between the various sports. The travel is a little lighter and different these days with only one sport going on, at this time. But again, for an NFL game, I have my stuff next to me on the right for this week. I probably put in 30 or 40 hours of work during the week, and that doesn't even include Friday and Saturday when we are actually in the city and we're during normal times meeting with players and coaches. Now we're doing it on Zooms, but I never feel like I'm working. It's such a fun job. Again, there's a lot that goes into it, but never feels like work ever for me personally.
I grew up and I thought of your dad. This is just me here in Michigan. I thought of him as a basketball guy and a boxing guy. So, and I didn't know, because I was here in Detroit, that obviously I've done my homework. And as you mentioned earlier, I know he started covering the Rangers in the 60s. But of all the sports you cover, because you cover everything, for you, and if you would go so far as to speak for your dad, what was and is the favorite sport in the Albert household?
So it's interesting. You mentioned that you thought of him as a basketball and boxing guy. Most people I meet who did not grow up in the New York area associate him with basketball, especially anyone between 30 and 50, because he was the voice of the NBA throughout the 90s, the Michael Jordan era. So we all watched The Last Dance, and his voice was all over that show. So if you're between 30 and 50 and you didn't grow up in New York, or even if you did, he's most associated with the NBA and NBC. Folks who grew up in the New York area who are over 50 still talk about his association with the Knicks and their championships in 1970 and 73. He called those games on radio. He was 28 when the Knicks won the championship in 1970. That game was not on television live. It was on delayed tape. So I run into people all the time who still talk about listening to that game 50 years ago on the radio, May 8th, 1970, when Willis Reed came out of the tunnel and on one leg and wound up scoring the first 2 baskets of the game. And Clyde Frazier, who I have the honor to work with 20 games a year on MSG, had the game of his life, 36 points, 19 assists, 7 rebounds, and the Knicks won their first championship. So for New Yorkers over the age of 50, that's the game they most associate him with. He did go on to call NFL football for over 20, 25 years at NBC, boxing. And then, later on with Turner, he's done the NBA on Turner for the last 20 or so years, going through the conference finals. So many of the youngsters know him as the voice of the NBA on Turner and on video games, EA Sports, through the years. So he's had really a number of different eras that he's gone through, but his first gigs were Rangers and Knicks on the radio. He grew up as an intern during his high school days for the great Marty Glickman, who was one of the, iconic play-by-play announcers of all time. And he was his statistician and then started filling in for him. And he did his first Rangers game trip in Detroit. He's told me the story on many occasions. I think it was in 1962 or 63 at the Olympia. He did a Rangers-Red Wings game. That was his first NHL broadcast. And his first NBA broadcast was a Knicks game at the Boston Garden. But that game at the Olympia was close to 60 years ago. That was his first NHL game. He actually did the Stanley Cup final on U.S. television for a number of years on a syndicated network. He did that memorable Flyers game against the Soviet Union back in the 70s. And then with the Rangers, he wound up calling the 94 Stanley Cup final game 7 on the radio side. He was still involved at that point. But, to him, he probably would not have admitted this, when I was growing up, because he was so involved in all the different sports. But, basketball is definitely his number one. His long-time association with the NBA. He's probably seen more NBA games than anybody in history, right? I would think. He's been an NBA broadcaster for over 50 years. So I don't know if there's anybody that's been to more NBA games in person. But with the Knicks for about 30 years, and then he did New Jersey and Brooklyn Nets games later on, the NBA and NBC, the NBA on Turner. So although he, worked thousands of NHL games and hundreds of football games and boxing matches, and he's one of the top 5 as far as guests on the David Letterman show. I think Regis Philbin is number 1, but he's definitely in the top 5 for sure. He used to do the Albert Achievement Awards, the sports bloopers on the David Letterman show. So a lot of people outside of New York would know him for that as well. But basketball is definitely his number 1. For me, like I said, as a kid growing up, I just wanted to do hockey on the radio. Hockey was my favorite sport. The others were right there. They weren't far behind. Basketball, baseball, football. I loved them all. But I played hockey. I played on a club team in high school.
What position?
I would characterize myself as a third-line winger. Didn't score too many goals. Third-line winger on a high school club team. Little-known fact trip at NYU. So I start college in September of '86, and I see a poster up in one of the buildings. Another fellow student wanted to start a club hockey team at NYU, ironically, my freshman year. So I wind up going to the meeting, and I helped him out with a lot of the administrative duties. And I also played on the team and played for 4 years. And we would practice once a week at midnight at Sky Rink in New York on the 16th floor of a building. We would play some games there, some games in Bayonne, New Jersey. And we would play against a lot of the local schools, Hofstra, Fordham, Columbia. So 2 quick stories. I scored the first goal in NYU history. I didn't score many, but I actually did score the first goal against the College of Staten Island. So I don't have the puck on my mantle anywhere.
What kind of goal was it, Kenny? Come on, you got to describe it.
The goalie was probably screened by about 5 people because I was near the boards, top of the circle on the right wing side, going towards the net.
Were you a lefty?
Right. I was a righty.
Oh, so you're on your natural side.
I'm on the right side, top of the circle against the boards, about 40 feet out. I take a weak wrist shot that somehow gets through. He had to have been screened.
Were you like Nick Lidstrom? When I've done games between the benches, I've never seen a guy that's got his head up. Roman Yossi, former dig-in guest, is like this too. Did you have your head up so you saw the traffic, so you knew where to just get it to the net? Did you have your head up or not? Tell the truth when you release that puck.
Probably not. As I said, the goalie was probably screened by anywhere between 5 and 7 players. He never saw it. And the program's actually gone on to great success. In recent years, they won a club championship a couple of years ago under head coach Chris Cosentino. So they've done some great things. But back then, it was a lot of fun. And, the other NYU hockey story, which I just learned about 5 or 6 years ago, I was working a Tampa Bay Montreal playoff game in Montreal with Joe Micheletti. And it was actually the game that led to the offside review. I don't know if you remember, there was an double overtime goal, Nikita Kucherov, and Brian Boyle was coming out of the zone. and the Lightning entered the zone, and it should have been offside, and Tampa Bay wound up winning the game. It was that game. And I had never met John Cooper at this point. He was in his first or second year as Tampa Bay head coach. We had never met. And Joe Micheletti and I were waiting to chat with him after the morning skate. You've been there a million times. Behind the visiting locker room in Montreal, in the hallway, there's a back door, and the coach sometimes would come out and speak behind that back door. And John Cooper's chatting with the media, and he sees Joe and I over to the left side, and he looks at me and says, "I need to talk to you after." And I'm thinking, did I say anything on the air? Did I do something that got back to him? I couldn't think of anything. I had never met John before. So he comes over and he says, "Did you play for NYU?" I said, "Yeah. How do you know that?" Now, I was aware that he attended Hofstra.
Yes.
And played lacrosse from my digging in, right? Doing research.
Oh, you're digging in research.
But I have no clue how the coach of the Tampa Bay Lightning knew that I played club hockey for NYU. It turns out we played against each other. And I remember playing against Hofstra. He played club hockey.
Yeah.
So, of course, my next question is, how do you even know that? How did you know that I played for NYU? A buddy of his from college who lives and works in New York somehow was aware that I played for NYU, and we figured out that we were there at the same time. So I actually played against John Cooper in college, and we've become pretty good friends since then. But that was my introduction, John letting me know that we played against each other 25 years prior.
You mentioned Joe Micheletti, great man. I remember when I first started, and Joe was, doing a long stretch as the analyst for the New York Islanders. Of course, he is the television analyst, not just with NBC, but with the Rangers. John Cooper, boy, good for him, sticking with it. What a coach, and winning the Stanley Cup. In any sport,
we mentioned Joel Quenneville and Barry Trotz before. When I think back, it's amazing. To the last, 5 or 6 years, the Stanley Cup winning coaches, John Cooper this year, with the Tampa Bay Lightning, of course, in 2020. Barry Trotz in 2018 winning the Cup. Craig Berube in 2019 played for Washington when I was there. Joel Quenneville, and Mike Sullivan was an assistant coach with the Rangers during my time. So, when you work in a sport long enough and you get to know so many people, but when the good people in the game do well and have success, and not that I had anything to do with any of their championships, but the fact that I worked with or was involved, with teams that Barry Trotz, John Cooper, Joel Quenneville, Mike Sullivan, and Craig Berube were a part of. You're just so happy for those folks when they have success and wind up, at really the pinnacle of their sports.
Kenny, the truth is that, and don't let this go to your head, which I know you won't. The kind of person you are, you don't have anything that even approaches an enemy on planet Earth. I mean, that's how likable of a guy you are. I mean, it's just who you are. So these guys, they build sincere relationships with you. They know with you, what you see is what you get. They know how genuine you are. It's just special. It's special that transcends sports, and super to see. I've been lucky enough now with the great game of hockey that most Stanley Cup winning teams, I have special relationships with one or two guys for sure. In any sport, as you were talking about John Cooper, talking about Joe Micheletti, can you remember, doesn't have to be hockey, an analyst, whether it's a former player, a coach, either you had worked with him for a bit or you worked with him or her for the first time, and you said, wow, this guy, this woman, she's good. And you just knew that this is a good analyst.
Tim Mccarver comes to mind, probably the greatest baseball analyst of all time, and a great person. We still keep in touch. I worked about 30 or 40 games with Tim through the years. But I'll never forget, it was a little intimidating working with Tim for the first time. I had watched him on TV as a 15-year-old when he was doing Mets games, and all of a sudden, 15 years later, I'm in a booth with him. And I just remember having to be on my toes and ready for anything because he was just so sharp. And, as we wound up working more and more games together, we developed a relationship. But I just remember saying, wow, He is just at the top of his game. He's the best in his profession, and really had to, like I said, be on my toes at all times, because he would first guess. He would see things before they would happen. Had a really memorable night with Howie Long and Terry Bradshaw. We were put together as a crew to work the Sugar Bowl in 2007. It was Notre Dame against LSU. Jamarcus Russell and Brady Quinn. LSU wound up blowing them out in the second half. Howie and Terry, of course, are icons. They've been in the Fox studio since '94, and Fox decided to have them go out and do this game. And it was an honor that the executives chose me to be in the booth with Howie and Terry. And for a couple of weeks leading up to it, we would go to empty stadiums wherever they were traveling to do the pregame show at the time, and we would do rehearsals off monitors. And 3 or 4 days before the game, we got into town in New Orleans, and we had also visited the 2 campuses to chat with coaches, and they were just so much fun to be around. They were all in. Howie had never done a game before. I don't think he's done a game since then either. So he was learning, how to use the cough button, the talkback button. He wasn't used to being in a booth, and he asked me to help him out. And Terry Bradshaw had done games for CBS years and years prior, and as you can imagine, just such a fun guy to be around. And that's the one game that I never went back to watch. I often go back to watch or listen to my games. I just had such a good feeling about it, working with Howie and Terry. I didn't want it to be ruined by going back and watching the game. And then one of the biggest compliments of all time, Terry was on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno 2 nights later, and he asked him about the broadcast, and he mentioned me. Terry mentioned me and Howie and talked about the broadcast for a minute or two. So that's one that stands out for sure. But having the opportunity to work with some of the top analysts, whether it was Tim McCarver, as I mentioned, in baseball, John Davidson in hockey, who I worked a number of games with, who, in my opinion, he set the standard. He was the greatest of all time. He was the first to put a satellite dish in at his house and watch other games and, set the standard as far as note-taking and chatting with players and coaches. And Joe Micheletti learned from JD. He even uses the same system, folding over papers from a yellow pad 3 times and taking notes the same way that JD used to do it. Working with Eddie Olczyk and Pierre Maguire and Brian Boucher and my partner Dave Maloney at the Rangers. And then on the football side, I worked a number of games with Troy Aikman and my regular partners through the years, Moose Johnston and Rondé Barber, and now Jonathan Vilma. Back in the day, Tim Green and Anthony Munoz, Brian Baldinger, Ron Pitts, Walt Clyde Frazier on basketball games. So I've really had the opportunity to work with a number of all-time greats in their sports. And on my list of color analysts, I have so many other names. I worked 1 game with Paul Molitor. I worked games with David Cohn. I worked a couple of games with Jim Palmer. So although it was only 1 game with some of those names, or a few, just great memories. I look up at my wall and I have pictures with Howie and Terry and with Tim McCarver and Jim Palmer and Patrick Ewing, who was my color analyst on a NBA Summer League back in 1996. So just a thrill to be able to work with all of those folks and really all of the analysts that I've ever worked with in a broadcast booth.
Well, hey, listen, just make some room with that ever-expanding list for a guy that goes, that has the initials TT.
We have to do it one of these days, right?
We have to do it. The only thing I can promise you, partner, is I just waltz into that booth, and through the years, I just say to myself, Trip, you don't get paid by the word.
That's always a good reminder.
Oh, God, yes. Because it's hard for us as broadcasters. I think I sensed you feel the same way, to go home and watch our games. It's hard for me to watch the podcast to figure out how to get better.
I was just thinking before we started about 2 things that I wish I had said at the end of the football game the other day. Now, it's a live broadcast.
Yeah.
And there's so much going on, and the producer's talking in your ears, and there's always something that you wish you had said that you didn't say, or maybe something that you said that you wish came out differently. But it's live TV, it's live radio. It's never as bad as you think it is when you go back and watch it back. Similar to players, I'm sure, you're never as bad as you think you are in a loss, and you're never as good as you think you are in a win. So I do go back and watch and listen frequently. I think it's valuable. For example, if you start using the same phrase too often,
Yes.
Self-scouting to correct yourself. But there are always those little things that you do pick up, which is why I've never gone back to watch that Sugar Bowl game, because I have such a great memory of it from 2007 that I didn't want that memory ruined.
Yeah, I remember my first ever game in Greensboro. I think I said certainly, the word certainly 27 times through.
Oh, yeah.
Through we weren't even through the second period.
My memory of Greensboro is the 98-99 season, right? When Wayne Gretzky came in with the Rangers
That
into
was my
Greensboro.
first year.
That was your first year. I was there for that one. And I'll never forget, Wayne was on the front page of the local newspaper, and I think he had a couple of points in the game.
It's I remember interviewing Wayne my first year broadcasting. It was a game against the Rangers at Madison Square Garden, and he made, I don't think they were great questions. I was really raw, but he made you think every question was a super question, even if it was a dolts of one.
Wayne Gretzky,
what an
Brett
ambassador.
Favre. Wayne Gretzky and Brett Favre are the two nicest superstar athletes that I've ever encountered. They always had the time for you, as much time as you needed. I was fortunate enough to be working the Rangers on the radio during Wayne's 3 years in New York. And, it's well documented that he was not a big fan of flying. So he wanted to stay distracted during flights. And we, the broadcasters, would sit up sort of towards the front, not all the way in the front, but in a small area with 4 seats on the left and 4 on the right, 4 broadcasters, and then some of the trainers. And Wayne would come up on the flights and sit with John Davidson because he respected, JD, just like we all do. He had great respect for JD. And they would just talk for the entire flight. And the rest of us were like flies on the wall. We were right there. But you will not find a superstar athlete as nice, as down-to-earth as Wayne Gretzky. And I put Brett Favre in that class as well.
Do you know that, because I started in 98 and John Davidson, those were some bad Rangers teams. This is pre-salary cap, at times the highest payroll in hockey.
Pre-Henrik Lundqvist.
And right near the worst record in the National Hockey League. And John Davidson found a way, and I've carried this with me to this day, and it's hard. And it got me through. It was probably the biggest message in the vehicle of the Hurricanes not making the playoffs for 10 years. John Davidson, during those rough years in a tough market like New York, he told the truth, but simultaneously seemed to never throw a player or the team under the bus. And then in the big picture, simultaneously sold the great game of hockey.
Absolutely.
And nobody has even come close to doing it at that level. And I've had the wonderful opportunity to tell him on several occasions how grateful I am for him teaching me that. And it's a craft. It's hard. So you're talking about his preparation. That's what I learned more than anything from him. You can point it out and satisfy the fans that want objectivity. Tim Mccarver did this very well too. You mentioned him earlier. Without throwing a guy or the team under the bus, and you can still sell whatever game it is, Kenny.
Absolutely. For my first 10 years with the Rangers at MSG, JD was the TV analyst, and I would get to watch him work on a day-to-day basis. And you talk about digging in. He had the respect of everybody in the hockey world, players, coaches, general managers, the league office, the commissioner, officials, and people would flock to him. He was a guy that people wanted to be around. And you're right. 7 straight years out of the playoffs. They won the Cup in 94. They made a run to the conference final in 97 with Gretzky and Messier together, the 1 year they were together in New York. But they made a number of trades in order to win the Cup and in order to get back to the conference final in 97. You have to give away part of the future. Guys like Tony Amonte and Doug Wade and Todd Marchant and Matthias Norstrom, they were guys who were traded away by the Rangers. I think any organization would have done the same thing in order to win a cup, right? You hadn't won in 54 years. So there were some down years without first-round draft picks and without a lot of prospects. And from 97, 98 until 03, 04, they missed the playoffs 7 straight years. 05, 06, a guy named Henrik Lundqvist comes in, 23 years old, to back up Kevin Weeks And I'll never forget, that was Dave Maloney's first year doing radio on a full-time basis. And the team opened the season in Philly with Tom Rennie behind the bench and Jaromir Jagr and Kevin Weeks in goal, and not a lot of expectations. Henrik takes over as the starter about 3 weeks later. They make the playoffs, amazingly, and wind up getting to the postseason 11 of the next 12 years, 3 trips to the conference final, 1 trip to the Stanley Cup final. But you're right. Those were some down years, but JD would sell the sport. He would sell the players and talk about good things the opponent did well. And he would dig in every night. He was watching every game and talking to coaches and general managers on the phone. And he really set the standard for color analysts, not only in the NHL, but in all sports.
You mentioned Terry Bradshaw with the cough button. And for those that don't know, on your headset when you're calling the game, you have a button. If you think you're going to cough or sneeze, you hit that so you just don't bombard whoever's listening on the air. Okay, but then what you can do too is you have a talkback button that you can talk to your producer, your director. In my case, as an analyst, if I want to replay a certain angle, what's coming next whistle, put the camera on the coach, that type of thing. And I want to ask you about a moment that didn't go your way within a game, where you're at a fork in the road, where you can feel sorry for yourself, you can let your call go down and really, go the wrong way, or you can dig in and go the right way at that fork. For me, Kenny, without going into detail, it was in Buffalo. And I meant to say a word, and it was like a Freudian slip. And the word that came out was not what I wanted. Let's just say that. So I hit the talk back. Play's still going on. And my producer, who I think you've worked with, Jim Malia,
Yep.
hit the talk back. I said, Jimmy, what do you want me to do, baby? Because I thought, should I apologize? What should I do? And he said, Trip, move on. Move on. That's teamwork. That's teamwork. And part of being a teammate, he's the producer. He's the coach. You don't question him. You do what he says. So I did, and it was tremendous coaching, and ended up having a good game. And I could have felt sorry for myself. So I would like to think I dug in. It was an unintentional slip, but I could have felt sorry for myself. Can you give me a story within a game in any sport, maybe early in the game, where you're thinking, uh-oh, what just happened? And you're at that fork in the road, you dig in.
I can't think of one specific moment. I know there have been times where, as a play-by-play announcer, you might misidentify a player or make what really is a minor mistake, but to you it seems pretty major. And you just start thinking about it, and it's bothering you as the game's moving on. And I think that was great advice from Jim Malia. Just forget about it, move on. If it's a major mistake, I feel like it has to be corrected. If it's something factual or involving a playoff scenario, for example, I think if you misspeak or make a mistake on something like that, you have to correct it. But if it's something pretty minor, I think moving on is probably the best advice. It's funny you mentioned the cough button. I remember a Rangers game in LA in the late 90s against the Kings where I felt the hiccups coming on during play. And with the hiccups, you don't always know when it's going to come out. So I had my finger on, I think it was a late game. We probably didn't have too many listeners anyway. And I think I was able to, block it out every time. I had to apologize for Snoop Dogg at the NHL All-Star Weekend. This is when I think back, a pretty funny moment. And Howard Stern actually played it on his show a couple of days or a couple of weeks later. It was 3 or 4 years ago, NHL All-Star Weekend. I was working the All-Star Friday events, the skills competition and the celebrity game, the charity game on NBCSN. And Snoop Dogg was the DJ on the ice. He was hired by the NHL to do the pregame entertainment and between periods and between events. And as a DJ, he's known as DJ Snoopadelic. That's his nickname. And while he was live on the air, he used some lyrics that he probably should not have. He had 2 different versions and wound up going with the wrong version. And to be honest, I didn't notice it. I might have been talking to the producer. I'm not listening to every word of the song. And I was informed that we had to apologize. So I had to then say something to the effect of, "We apologize for some of the language from DJ Snoopadelic." And I think Howard Stern found this apology pretty funny to hear this broadcaster at a hockey event apologizing for DJ Snoopadelic's language. So that wasn't something that I said, but it was a funny moment when I think back.
Oh, boy. Oh, announcer, voice,
Exactly.
Kenadelic apologizes for DJ Snoopadelic.
And it's funny because my kids think that I have a different, they call it my weird announcer voice. And it's nothing that I do purposely, but I guess once the game starts, I do kind of morph into somewhat of a different voice. So that apology was sort of in that weird announcer voice that they refer to.
With regards to your analysts and all the different sports that you work, do you intentionally adjust your call at all, knowing the strengths of who your analyst is, to put him or her in a position to succeed? Does that play into your call at all, or no?
Studying the analyst is a big part of it, especially if it's somebody I'm working with for the first time, because you want to lead them to the greatest success that they can have. So this year, for example, on the NFL, I'm working with Jonathan Vilma for the first time, the Pro Bowl linebacker, Super Bowl champion with the New Orleans Saints. And obviously he's looking at it from a defensive perspective. So I might lead him into certain things, ask him questions about what was it like playing against Drew Brees in practice for 6 years? What was it like going up against Aaron Rodgers and Peyton Manning? And he's told some great stories so far over the last 2 months. So I'll definitely study my analysts and look to lead them in a certain direction at times and ask them questions that have to do with either their playing career or their time playing for a certain coach. When I adjust, Trip, is if it's a 3-person booth, which is a lot different than just 2 of you, obviously. And in football for many years, 8 years, I worked with Moose Johnston and Tony Siragusa, and Tony was down in the field. So we didn't have that communication as far as standing next to one another. Moose and I could not see Goose. We couldn't necessarily tell when he wanted to get in with a comment or a thought. So there was a lot of nonverbal communication going on, and working with each other for all of those years, you certainly get into a rhythm. And, you know, during NHL games, occasionally I'm in the booth alone with a color analyst, whether it's Pierre or Joe or AJ or somebody else who's downstairs between the glass. And you get into a little bit of a different rhythm, again, because they're not next to you. You can't see them. If I'm working with Eddie Olczyk and Brian Boucher, for example, or Eddie and Pierre, or Eddie and AJ, you have one analyst next to you and one downstairs. So that's a different dynamic where I have to, speak less as a play-by-play announcer because there are 2 others who have thoughts to get in as opposed to just one analyst.
Yeah, good stuff. Also, if there are any young, aspiring play-by-play announcers, analysts out there watching on YouTube or listening to our podcast, what advice would you give of how your approach changes when you're calling a game only for radio and when you're doing one for television?
It's a question I get, Trip, all the time from some of the young broadcasters that I speak with. And there's a major difference between radio and TV, as you know. On radio, you have to describe everything that's going on. You have to give the time and score a lot more often because they can't see it up on the screen. To me, personally, hockey is the easiest sport to call. Most people think I'm crazy when I say that because of the speed of the game, the line changes, the pronunciations. But to me, it's like riding a bike. I've done it for 30 years professionally. And the puck's in action for 60 minutes. So you're calling the play for the entire 60 minutes. Basketball, similar to hockey, it's 48 minutes. It's a little slower. There are more stoppages. But the general idea, the play-by-play that you're doing is sort of similar to hockey. Football is the most rhythmic. It's one play, and then it's 15 or 20 or 25 seconds. Then it's another play, and it's 15 or 20 or 25 seconds. To me, of the 4, baseball is the most challenging because there's so much downtime. The ball's only in play 7 to 12 minutes, from what I'm told, in a game. So hopefully you have a really strong analyst with you to fill in that downtime. Boxing's a totally different animal because there's no puck, there's no ball. It's only 2 people in the ring, and it can end at any time. So you want to use a lot of your best information early on because you might have these great stories, some great background stuff, and never get it in if the fight ends in 2 rounds. So it's a lot different than the other 4 sports. I feel like you want to get the good stuff in early just in case. Now, radio versus TV, you speak less on TV as a play-by-play announcer. You could pull back. You don't have to identify every player that touches the puck. There's more room for the color analysts to come in. So, again, major differences between the 4 sports and also major differences between radio and television.
Oh, you got me with that answer. I mean, because we're taught in hockey, because the natural tendency, I especially early in my career, was to have a good television open and then come out of the gate, in the first period. Then if you're going good, hey, things are good. And then you coast, at least I'm falling on the sword, you coast a little bit. At the end of the day, any of the great producers out there and television mentors will say, you have to be at your best when the game's on the line, the third period or in the Stanley Cup playoffs in overtime. So boxing, knowing it could end at any time, and not to, if you have some material, that you think will be part of the storytelling experience, not to wait on it.
Right, because you talked earlier about going back and watching games and killing yourself about something you didn't mention.
Yeah.
But imagine if you did all this homework for a boxing match and you had 3 great stories.
Yeah.
And it ends in the second round and you didn't get any of them in.
It's unbelievable, and we're all told, and it's true. Because I remember my first year when the Hurricanes were playing in Greensboro, and I think, speaking of football that you're doing these days, Dennis Miller was doing football. And I heard him say something in one of the games, and I was like, wow, that's hilarious. I'm going to work this into the game. Wrong. It's because then it sounded scripted. You can see that he's been sitting on this all day. Now, truly, it's different. I'm an analyst. The way I prepare is I watch games. I try to build trust and talk to people like John Davidson. Nobody did it better. And then when the puck drops, it's a choose your own adventure. I don't know where I'm going. I have 5 or 6 things that, if there's nothing there that I can go to. But the most fun for me, Kenny, is letting the game take me wherever it does. And that's something it took a lot of reps to get comfortable with.
Absolutely. You have to let the game take you there. And you might have your checklist of things you want to get in at some point.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. 3 weeks ago, Jonathan Vilma and I and Shannon Spake, our terrific sideline reporter, we had the Dolphins-Rams game. It was Tua Tagovailoa's first start. So as you can imagine, all week we did so much preparation on Tua. We spoke to him on a Zoom call. I read articles from his Alabama days. I watched the documentary that was done on his comeback from the injury. So it was all about Tua. And in the open, obviously the first talking point was Tua. And then we got into the Rams. Game starts. Dolphins have the ball. They're backed up deep in their own territory. And we've set up the whole thing. Tua's first start, great college career. First play from scrimmage. He gets the ball knocked away by Aaron Donald, turns it over. Now the Rams have a 1st and goal on the 6-yard line. So all of a sudden you have to shift gears. It was all about Tua. And then turnover on the first play. And then the Dolphins defense had an unbelievable first half. They forced 4 turnovers by the Rams. So when we came on camera at halftime, I said to Jonathan Vilma, I said, Jonathan, during the week before the game, it was all about Tua. But in the first half, it was all about the Dolphins defense. So we had to switch gears. Yeah,
you have to. That's why I say choose your own adventure. There's about A, B, C, D, E, F, G routes that it can go. As an analyst, I've learned to trust my gut, be willing to take a chance. Sometimes you're going to be right. Sometimes you're going to be wrong. With all these lessons, you've mentioned a couple really special, meaningful games and events throughout the episode. It's my job to ask you tough questions. Kenny, if you had to pick one so far in your great career, one game or an event that you've called that stands above all others, what would it be?
You're putting me on the spot, Tripp.
I am.
I have to mention 3 or 4. I can't limit it to one.
I knew you would.
I can't limit it to one.
All right.
As far as a broadcast, I told you about the Howie Long, Terry Bradshaw game earlier.
Yep.
That was from a broadcast standpoint. But the 94 Stanley Cup final when the Rangers won Game 7 against Vancouver, I was working in Washington at the time. By a tremendous stroke of fortune, I wound up getting a call to work the series for NHL radio. with Sherry Ross, who was a longtime color analyst for the Devils.
Great person,
great
excellent
person.
analyst.
So we worked Game 7. We worked the entire series, but in particular, so I have to put Game 7 up there, Rangers Canucks for NHL radio. The game that I get asked about most often, believe it or not, is a baseball game. It was the Jose Bautista home run and bat flip in the playoffs in 2015. I was working that game for Fox up in Toronto. So 94 Game 7, Jose Bautista game. I also have to put up there the women's gold medal game in 2018 in Pyeongchang, working with AJ Malesko and Pierre Maguire. That's right up there in my top 5 for sure. When the U.S. won in a shootout over Canada. Canada had won the prior 4 gold medals. Those 3, I've worked 5 divisional playoff games in the NFL. I worked the Super Bowl, the international feed. So I've been real fortunate to work a lot of the big events. But I would put those 3 games up there. And I would have to include, from recent memory, Pierre and I worked in one day 2 Game 7s in the playoffs in Edmonton this year in the bubble. Second round in the West. We did Dallas, Colorado, and Vancouver, Vegas, 2 Game 7s in one day. That's something that was never done before. It couldn't be because the games were never played in the same building and probably won't ever happen again. So that day with a couple of Game 7s in one day was so much fun as well.
If you had to think of one player, could be a Ranger, could be anybody, that when you think of what exemplifies digging in and then share why, who would it be?
Mark Messier.
Let's hear it. Anything behind the scenes?
Rangers plane trip in Western Canada, 1997 or 98, somewhere around that era, maybe 96. We were in Vancouver, and we were going to Edmonton for the next game. And there were so many former Oilers on the Ranger team at the time. Mark Messier, Kevin Lowe, Charlie Huddy, I think, was still around. Maybe Craig McTavish, Adam Graves, Jeff Bukaboom. There were probably 6 former Oilers. And it was the only trip to Edmonton that year. Many of them had family and friends. They were waiting to see them that night on an off night. There was an issue with the plane in Vancouver. So the charter was going to be delayed 3 or 4 hours. Team management said, we'll get the 6 Edmonton guys on a commercial flight so they can get in early. They have plans. They have friends and family to see. Mark Messier stood up at the front of the plane and said, nope, we go as a team. We'll wait. We'll go with the entire team.
That's a wow answer. You're going to have some big skate shoes to fill as we move on to other sports.
Wow, that's a true story. I was there for that one.
Well, that's the real deal. Okay, football.
Boy, that's a tough one. I'm going to go with my former partner, Tony Siragusa. And some of the stories he would tell about being at the bottom of a pile, trying to get in to recover a fumble, and everybody's grabbing it at any body part you could think of. And he just had the most unbelievable stories. We had the 50-50 rule with Tony. The 50% of the stories that you thought could not be true, those are the ones that were true. So I used to love his stories about, getting to the bottom of the pile. But he would study film. I mean, when he would talk about the Ravens Super Bowl run and what that defense was able to do with Ray Lewis and Tony up front and some of the others, they dug in during that championship run back in 2000. So I'll say my former broadcast partner, Tony Siragusa.
Basketball.
I'm going to go with Walt Clyde Frazier, one of my partners. He's so well known now for the way he dresses and for his rhymes on TV during the broadcast. He's one of the kindest individuals you'll ever meet. I've never seen him turn down a photo or autograph request. But when he was a player, he dug in. I mentioned that Game 7 in 1970. Willis Reed was the story, but anyone that was at the game or watched that game, Clyde Frazier won that championship. 36 points, 19 assists, 7 rebounds. He dug in on the court. He has to dig in deep into his closet. He has 125 suits that he rotates. Never wears the same one twice in one season. If you check out, I've posted some pictures on Instagram from games we worked together, but there's a gentleman named Clyde So Fly. Clyde So Fly on Instagram, and he takes a picture off the television every Knicks broadcast, and he'll post what Clyde is wearing that day. So he has dug in more than anybody as far as his wardrobe. 125 suits per season. Clyde Frazier digging in.
Outstanding stuff, Kenny. I think I have type O blood. I think you have type B broadcasting blood. And before we get into rapid fire, I can't tell you. Well, it's just the sport of hockey, because without hockey, you wouldn't be my friend. And I'm genuinely appreciative and grateful for that. Well, I'm going to bring in Adam the Admiral Holtzman, my producer. By the way, Adam, before I check and see if you have a question for me, I said at the top of the show, tip of the visor. What a job you've done on our website, digintrip.com. Outstanding. And that's been your baby. Excellent job. You deserve a lot of praise. You've dug in. Are you there?
I appreciate it, partner. Just one question for you. After hearing from Kenny, obviously your background is hockey, but what other sport would you most like to call as an analyst?
It's a very timely question, because Admiral, two-time dig-in guest John Isner, just reached out to me this past weekend and said, Tripp, would you enjoy doing some tennis work? And that was my first sport that I played. I was good at getting the ball back, no power. But before I got into hockey, that would be very intriguing to me. Having just watched the Masters and Dustin Johnson winning, golf is a sport that I'm very passionate about. I'd like to think I'm pretty educated. So tennis and or golf. I just pulled a Kenny Albert, Admiral. I gave two sports. I probably would go with tennis, because it meant a lot to me that a guest that we've had two times, Adam, John Isner, suggested that I perhaps take a whirl at looking at tennis. So I'll go tennis. Great question. And I guess I might as well just slide right into thanking Kenny Albert once again, reminding everybody to be very active in bringing down any wall in terms of the communication that exists on our audio platforms, YouTube. Make sure you're very interactive about how you feel about digging in right now, how we can be better, how we can satisfy you more. As I just mentioned, in gratitude to my producer and partner, check out the website, digintrip.com. These, you just saw on YouTube my mom wearing the Patriot hat. Wanted to come out with that because I think it's more important right now at these volatile times, a lot of disagreements in our country, to remember that we live in the greatest country, not just on planet Earth, but the red, white, and blue, the greatest country in the history of planet Earth. So digintrip.com. Thank you so much to our presenting sponsor, New Country Auto Group, dealerships, New York, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Florida, Lexus, BMW, Mercedes, Ferrari, Smart Car, list goes on and on and on. newcountry.com, family owned, family run, complete and total, digging in everything they do, including their long-standing loyal relationship with us. And again, a reminder to go check out Rapid Fire for the first time on YouTube. Brought to you by Ad Audio 627, fastest ship on the sea. And it also has red, white, and blue colors, that beautiful Hydra Sport that is Ad Audio's 627. So until the next time, I'm telling you, every time you look in the mirror doesn't lie. We all know that. It's going to tell you, and then you're going to know. Are you really digging in? Or are you halfway digging in? The game of digging in is for sale if you're willing to pay the price. No shortcuts. So bear that in mind, and hopefully you'll have a favorable reaction to that mirror. And we'll see you soon for our next episode.
We're digging in with Tripp today, yeah. Today, yeah. Today, yeah. Today.